For trainers, collectives, and individuals that were looking for a program to follow that was chud free, or perhaps one that came directly from us, there is Liberation Martial Arts Online. Thanks to Justin Hamilton, Jared, and Tim Fitzpatrick for signing up. If you want to sign up for Liberation Martial Arts Online or want to increase your financial support for the Southpaw Project, you can find special tiers on our Patreon. If you'd like to listen to all of our shows without any breaks or interruptions, you can also find uncut versions of our shows along with Fighters Brew and SDS9 on Patreon. This is Sam.
This is Jason.
And this is Fight Study.
This episode was sponsored by SH, M. Shelton, Berkshire People's Gym, and New Guy. Coach Jason and I are back to talk about the much anticipated UFC 286, headlined by the trilogy fight between champion Leon Edwards versus former champion and former number one pound for pound Kamaru Usman. But I would be remiss if we didn't talk at all about Peter Yan versus Merab Dvalishvili from the previous UFC fight night. Yan is on paper one of the most technical MMA fighters out there. We've talked about how good he is to watch and what you can learn from him. But going into this fight, he was 1-3. And regardless of whether he deserves those losses or not, that's got to weigh on you because you're losing a lot of money and that much closer to being cut and that much further away from another title shot. I also feel like Yan takes the wrong lessons from losses. When he was on his way up, I think Yan didn't underestimate his opponents. But since his first fight with Sterling, I feel like he doesn't give his opponents enough respect and fights with a chip on his shoulder, and it's been backfiring. Now, there's a concept that I want to talk about that's integral to our liberation martial arts curriculum and theory, and that's time space. By time space, I mean the time and space necessary to execute a move or technique. Yan is technical and adaptive, so he needs time and space to make his reads. What Dvalishvili did so well was to disrespect Yan's time space by going first and crashing space. Dvalishvili doesn't have to be better than Yan in any one area, but constantly eliminating space and making Yan constantly run behind robbed Yan of the opportunity to be offensive. That's how important time space is, that when you don't have it, it doesn't matter if you're the better fighter. You're only as good as the room you have to express your ability. And if you don't have that room, you're just not that good. Jason, is there anything you wanted to add about this fight?
Well, I think you nailed it, Sam. Merab is really good at making good fighters not that good. Right? So what I might add is that Merab's volume of wrestling and striking typically comes at the expense of a fighter's conditioning. And fatigue is a very real cost. But Merab has truly astonishing cardio and muscle endurance. And when you add in his chin and just his overall physical strength, you get a fighter that can make a 50-45 beating of Piotr Yan look pretty goddamn easy. And here's what I will say, because I try to avoid Twitter MMA in between our episodes, but to the fans that continue to hate on Merab, let me say this to you. You don't have to like it. You don't have to appreciate it, and you sure as fuck don't have to respect it. But your favorite 135er does, because he's the most difficult matchup for any goddamn fighter in the bantamweight division, and that includes Aljamain Sterling. So, that's what you got, folks. If you don't like it, beat it. And I guarantee you're going to have a real fucking hard time coming up with a recipe for that, because no one else can.
You've seen Dvalishvili in the training room, right? So you've seen his cardio firsthand?
Oh, I have. He trains like a hurricane whirlwind every time. He's always all go.
Every session.
I think he gets cut every session also. He's really forward moving and aggressive. And it's, how do I put it? It is like a well-executed, controlled aggression. But I mean, there's only so much control you can have against another fighter coming forward. And a lot of times you have multiple people on the mat. And, but you talk about just a grizzled and resilient human being. He's always good-natured. If he gets hit, he doesn't ever seem to get frustrated or upset. If he fails on a takedown attempt, he just goes again and again and again and again. He doesn't have that. He's got what I call it, a goldfish brain. He's able to compartmentalize and just forget about any bad experience. And then he just smothers you with volume and aggression. And it's a really tough thing to, what do the people say? People are drowning in volume. Well, he does that day in and day out, and he's built for it. And even if I trained the fighter to the best of my ability and just kept spiking his Gatorade with EPO, I don't know that I could create that.
I think a great example of Dvalishvili's cardio is his fight with Ricky Simone, which he lost. But in the third round, he was caught in a submission. The dude turned blue and purple, and it was a technical submission. I don't remember how exactly it ended, but he was continuing to fight even though he was basically choked out. And like you could tell there was no blood circulating in him, but he was still somehow going, which is like, now it makes sense. It wasn't just one of those weird medical things or a fluke. You see his cardio and it's like, yeah, even when he's like not getting any blood to the brain, he still just has enough oxygen in his body as reserves where he could still keep going.
Right? Whatever oxygen is left in any cell, what the remnants of any ATP to create energy in any cell in his body are all saying, fight, motherfucker, fight. And he, regardless of the oxygen going to his brain, his body doesn't stop. And it's pretty fantastic. And if you see him train that way, if you really know him, like what you see is what you get. And even without oxygen, and it's not a conscious decision for his body to keep fighting. He's just built for it, or he's etched it in to his genome to the point where even without oxygen, his body just keeps going.
Now let's talk about the main event from UFC 286. Welterweight champion Leon Edwards defending his title against former champion Kamaru Usman in a rubber match. We all agree Usman beat Edwards every round of their first fight, though Edwards had his moments. Then in the second fight, we all agree Usman had won rounds 2, 3, and 4 pretty dominantly, with Edwards finding his groove in rounds 1 and 5 and finishing the fight. And it was a finish with a head kick that he had thrown in their first fight as well, though it didn't work in the first fight. So Leon's team had been reading that kick for a while and has been studying Usman for a long time. But the tenor of this fight was completely different. What was once a bad style matchup for Edwards had flipped, and now it looked like a bad style matchup for Usman. And yes, Edwards had his fouls, but rather than helping him, I feel like the fouls will always take away from his performance. Edwards seemed so well planned and studied for Usman, even though their last fight wasn't that long ago. Maybe this was the fight he was supposed to have if it wasn't for the altitude. And that last fight was the first time in his career he had ever fought in altitude. Jason, what was different about this fight than their last fight, and how did both fighters look to you?
Well, first, I would say the most obvious thing was the absolute confidence I saw in Leon Edwards. Like everything from his walkout to his reactions seemed to be steeped in confidence. And I'll say this because I you know me, I almost always favor the wrestlers. But for some reason, and maybe it's my recency bias of their last fight, but the size, speed, and technique of Leon Edwards really, really stood out for me. And I do like Leon Edwards a lot. I think he's an absolutely fantastic fighter. But I was really starting to pull for Usman, not because he was a wrestler, but because I felt like he was the physical underdog. And I know that sounds crazy, and I really can't believe I'm saying it out loud, but goddamn, Leon Edwards looks so big and fast and amazingly technical. I mean, I couldn't help but have a soft spot in my heart for Usman, thinking that somehow it's like the second most physically gifted 170-pounder I've seen in quite some time, also with an astounding fight IQ and a great camp. All of a sudden, I have like an underdog concept or consideration to him when he's fighting Leon Edwards, because Edwards just looks so big and so fast and so technical that it actually pulled away from how big and how fast and how technical Usman really is. If you ask me what I really liked about this fight or what really stood out, I think this is another example of what mixed martial arts is supposed to look like at the highest level. We witnessed two highly technical and very well-rounded physical outliers that truly and really do understand fighting. And I absolutely fucking loved it. Edwards and Usman are two very, very physically gifted fighters. You don't get to the top of a very tough 170-pound division if you're not. But they've continued to develop their striking and their grappling, all with very real consideration of distance, leverage, and timing, as well as fight strategy, defense, setups, hand positioning, strength and conditioning, cardio, fence and cage techniques. I fucking loved it, and I really didn't understand any of the hate on the social media channels when we were gifted with that kind of, I don't know, that kind of technical prowess at the highest stage of combat sports.
Now, Usman really had a hard time getting his takedowns, and it became apparent after a while, if it stayed standing, Edwards was the better striker. What was going on with Usman's takedowns? Because his takedown finishes were unusually low in this fight. He also couldn't hold Edwards down.
It's a pretty straightforward answer. Leon Edwards is good. He's a type of fighter, sort of like GSP, where his commitment to wrestling really shines through with the addition of the cage wall, his physical strength, and understanding of hip position. It's not just wrestling defensively anymore. Edwards has improved his wrestling as a whole. And I think that's going to continue to make him an even greater threat in the striking department. And you're seeing some hesitance, and you're seeing some fatigue set in with fighters who are notoriously aggressive and well conditioned. Because even as well conditioned as Usman usually is, Usman had trouble taking down and holding down Leon Edwards, who is a strong counter wrestler with some, I'll say, some budding wrestling chops. We're seeing it in the making at 31 years old.
Now, whenever they did exchange, Edwards seemed to get the better of it, but Usman has been outstriking all of his previous opponents, and no one's going to deny how good his striking has gotten. So why was it favoring Edwards when Edwards was the one who had to worry about the takedowns?
Well, I think that boils down to footwork, speed, and skill advantage. Also size. It goes back to the confidence of being a complete mixed martial artist against another complete mixed martial artist with dominant wrestling. So I also think Leon Edwards naturally has a very high fight IQ, and that all the previous rounds really benefited him in terms of picking up the timing of Usman. Plus, Edwards is only 31, and though Usman's only 4 years older at 35, he's got some of those wrestler miles on him. But, again, even at 35, Usman is still probably the second best welterweight in the world. And at 35, though he looks slower than he once did, he still looks really fast. And he looks like he can always hang with the best of the best at 170 pounds. We'll probably see him do that until 36, 37. And, if he sticks around to 38, he's still going to be a handful until then.
There was a point where Edwards shot for a takedown and failed on it. But do you think, even though it failed, that attempt and some other attempts to out-wrestle Usman and fight him on the ground helped Edwards in the long run?
I definitely do. And I'll say it again. Confidence, confidence, confidence. I really think wrestling is that skill set that makes all the other skills shine a little bit brighter. You can take more chances if you know that you can recover from takedown attempts. You can sneak a takedown if you get clipped or if your opponent gets a little wild. It gives you confidence that a shitty do-nothing takedown with 30 seconds left isn't going to start having you give away rounds. Confidence is what is the difference between a split second or a millisecond of hesitation. And that's the difference in a game that is fraught with everyone saying, "Oh, he got lucky," is a lucky shot. Those shots are born of the confidence to find those shots. And I think that the more you develop that ability, and and become a more, and like I said, wrestling seems to be that skill that combines the other skill sets and allows them to shine a little bit brighter. When you have the confidence to stay on your feet, and you're not just going to be taken down, and you're not going to Nate Diaz it and saying, "Oh, he's too afraid to fight me on his feet." Well, you're going to find shots because you have the confidence to stay grounded and not always give ground, or give ground, plant, and go. Why? Because you've done it, right? And you get the repetition, time, and exposure. The timing comes from that repetition and that exposure, having been there and found it before.
And it gives Usman one more thing to worry about, right? Which causes some hesitation.
It really does. And because he took Usman down in that first, or in that second fight, there had to be some concern that what you are the most dominant at, and Usman is a fantastic wrestler, when you are that good at it and someone who is the better striker sneaks you with their own takedown, now you're in a mixed martial arts competition. You are in a fight against someone who has improved where you're great, to the point where in that moment he was better than you. He bested you in that moment. That changes the way you attack that person. It also changes the way you defend against that person. And because we're talking about a fighter in Kamaru Usman who is well coached, has a tremendous fight IQ, has had a lot of championship experience, he's taking those things into consideration. His brain is built to respond to those things. And not always is it respond with counter aggression. Sometimes it's, "Oh shit, I didn't know this asshole could wrestle too. Now this is what we have to do. Fuck," right? So it changes some things, and it certainly gives him something else to consider, and definitely something else to look at when he's in there.
Edwards created a high-low problem where you could tell Usman the whole fight was worried about that head kick, but now he had to think about double legs, which made him really, in some ways, like stiff and upright, hesitant, which I think also opened up those body kicks.
Oh, the body kicks were outstanding. The ability to counter, the ability to go to a jab at the very beginning of the fight, and then to stay away from it in favor of the lower attacks like the leg kicks, and then go back to it a little bit later, or throw 3-2, and then whenever he ducks into it, throw that knee. Like everything was layered, but not in the typical way we see a lot of strike variation throughout with high volume. There's a little bit less volume at times, and just well-conceived setups and building when it was time to build, so that he didn't give away position. He didn't give away easy takedowns or takedown attempts and get stuck against the cage. And even his stance switches were born of the ability to get his back foot separated to the point where he had enough distance between lead foot and back foot that he could shuffle and shift off and not get pinned against the cage when there was like that forward pressure from Usman. He made sure that he still had his hip open and there was an exit, and could still shift off without running into any of those giveaway exits where you lead them to that door, and while they're leaving, you fucking slam it on them. So he had enough consideration to find himself closing in on what do we call it? We call it the in baseball, the warning track. You get close to that cage, and then you open up those hips and you shuffle off so you don't get both your hips pinned against the cage. And he did that. He knew where he was. And again, you'll hear me say, just because they're so big for 170 pounds, but you add in their combined fight IQ and how technically well fought that fight was. And it is about as teachable of a fight, offensive wrestling, defensive wrestling, just because the entries were good, and the ability to hike up that single leg and run the pipe immediately off of it because you're struggling to get the finishes and having to work hard against a guy who's a big body type and has a wide stance and able to against the cage and has enough length to make you work and have a difficult time of locking those hands. So knowing the correct thing to do wrestling wise, you can also understand, you can also teach the correct response to the correct things wrestling wise. And that correct defense creates counter opportunities. Then you just start to build off of it. And it was some of the things that, I mean, let's just say it, right? Edwards isn't afraid to cheat a little bit. And he's just not.
Yeah, yeah.
And there's a little bit of there's some stuff that goes on in wrestling that isn't always on the up and up. And we can't, I'm not saying that Usman's entire career he's been a saint, and I think he actually tried to grab the shorts in the first or second round of Edwards, but that kind of jockeying will happen. But at the same time, it was, from a coaching perspective, it was a truly outstanding fight.
And to add to what you said about layers without a ton of volume, I think Edwards had like 74, 75% strike accuracy, which is very, very unusual in high level MMA because people are so hard to hit. So he could do a lot without having to throw a lot.
And it was great. And he still would give ground if he got hit rather than engaging in that I have to get that back in the moment. Again, that is born of confidence and adherence to a game plan. And that's something I think he and his team do very well. It's also something Whitman and his team and Usman and his team do very well. So I like seeing a battle between two gifted fighters with really strong camps, and see like how that sort of physical battle and the battle of the wits sort of play out.
A note to our listeners: if you love the Southpaw Project, please support us and help us get paid for our labor by financially supporting us on Patreon. This will give you access to exclusive bonus content, like early releases of Southpaw Deep Space Nine, our fictional narrative podcast, Fighters Brew, break-free versions of our shows without interruptions like you're hearing now, bonus articles, Fighters Brew transcripts with extra content, Liberation Martial Arts Online, as well as our private chat group on Discord. You can also make one-time donations at Ko-Fi or show your solidarity by wearing our swag. You can find all pertinent links at southpawpod.com. Edwards throughout the fight kept finding those knees. Then in the final round, his corner told him to trust the uppercuts, that it's there, and it was. What was his corner reading?
I think they understood that Usman was still in it, and at least to the point where a takedown or two might get him a nod in a very close round. So they were reading they were reading the situation. And after sharing in a cage for like well over an hour with Usman, they trusted the moment, and they weren't wrong. At least in my opinion, it was an excellent technical battle by two outstanding fighters who were, like I said, were also very well coached. And I loved it. And they trusted that shot would be there in that moment based on the things that they saw, and also sort of reverse engineering on if, hey, they needed to sneak around to get back in this fight. What might you do? How would you play it? And I think those considerations we're starting to see. There were some coaches, and I'll say this real quick. So there are some coaches that I may have criticized in the past, and I've been around the block quite a bit. I've trained with some really good guys. I've coached with some really good coaches. Some of them I was really impressed by. Others not so much. But the more, right? And I don't mean that to be condescending or arrogant. But sometimes I'm condescending and arrogant, so I apologize. But I'm seeing some coaches continue to improve at the world championship level. And I like it. I really do. Because this isn't just about, some of them may have been great at the very beginning because they had access to great fighters. And I may have criticized them saying, hey, they're getting the best of the best because of reputation and branding. Now I'm starting to see some of these fighters or some of these coaches continue to develop, much like the Volkanovskis. And I think that now we can start to put Leon Edwards in that conversation. And some of these camps in that conversation. If you are good because you are great because you have access to great talent, that is not the same as being able to develop great talent, right? You will be limited by their physical ceiling. If you have the ability to coach, if you have the ability to absorb a violent, fast, and very chaotic sport in real time, well, I mean, then you're able to communicate that to your fighter who's getting world championship rounds and seeing things. It's like football when everyone talks about the speed of the game. Eventually you start to adapt and you're seeing greater adaptation. So I'm seeing some of these coaches, and I'll say Whitman, Longo's team, like they're doing some good shit. And for a while I thought it was, and I don't think I was 100% wrong, they had access to grade A talent and weren't always doing grade A things with them. But I think now they are. And the proof is in what we're seeing on a regular basis from teams like that.
Kind of like the Dvalishvili performance in reverse. Edwards, in my opinion, won this fight by being able to protect his time space and outpointing Usman. So not letting Usman do to him what Dvalishvili did to Peter Yan. It's not just about one side. It's not just about the person who's trying to crash space. It's also about the person who's trying to protect the space and doing that by the points that Jason brought up. Footwork, but also defensive responsibility. Things that we've mentioned a lot, where defense isn't like in the second fight where Edwards just shelled up. This time he was defensive, but also striking back to keep Usman off of him, to keep Usman from crashing that space. So he protected a space, and once he had space to play, Edwards was the better fighter.
I wholeheartedly agree. And I think what you see is a younger talented fighter starting to truly develop into his prime as a fighter against a former champion that has been dominant for some time. And now we're seeing like the true talent that is Leon Edwards really start to come to fruition and show himself.
Next, let's talk about Justin Gaethje versus Rafael Fiziev. We've talked about Fiziev before, and you said it's just high-level shit when we see him fight, like when he fought Brad Riddell. And I feel like we got that again, and another fight of the year contender. What did you think about this fight?
Well, I think Fiziev looked like the most entertaining fighter in the UFC against arguably the most entertaining fucking fighter in the UFC. And it didn't disappoint.
No.
If neither one of these guys had a chin, it wouldn't have made it outside the first round. It was truly astounding. And just the heat that Fiziev brings, man, shit. Like credit to Justin Gaethje for just having that sort of poise and wherewithal to just eat it like they didn't matter, and then find his counter shots eventually. I don't know what else to say. It was. I will say it again because this is one of my better quotes. It looked like the most entertaining fighter in the fucking UFC against arguably the most entertaining fighter in the fucking UFC. That's what we got.
It was mayhem.
It was, and it was. I mean, it was probably the closest thing to like if Swangin' and Bangin' had a baby with educated brawling. It was. I mean, imagine if I don't know, you had some sort of like Felder Frivola baby, you know, like just both with great chins and aggression. One's tougher and a little bit more wild. One's tough and wild, and the other's tough and technical. It's just fun to see that kind of shit come together, and they brought out some of each other's strengths, and they shined a little bit of light onto, I don't want to say some weaknesses, but I'll say if it were a 5-round fight, things might have got a little bit dicey for Fiziev. I still thought he might have won it. I mean, I'd have to watch it again. I mean, I've watched it twice, but I didn't score any rounds because I just kept smiling. So I didn't really score it at all.
I want to get into that at the end, but before we talk about the scoring, it did seem like the first minute, Gaethje was trying to be tactical and be more reserved and calculated. And then he realized, oh, I can't do that with this motherfucker. I just need to get in there.
Yeah, because he's bringing heat and he's really, really accurate. And I've never seen someone string together that many power shots in a row, but almost never fall out of position. And even when he does, Fiziev has that, again, high level athletes doing high level shit is really what I love seeing. And you start to see a guy so it went back and forth. So you started to see Gagey, who tried to be a little bit more reserved and technical, have to open up and be a little, because just the aggression in Fiziev, but then he had to dial it in later in the fight. So that ebb and flow and shift in strategy. I mean, again, when you start getting to the highest level of this sport, you can't always just be all piss and vinegar and swanging and banging, right? You have to have a little bit more. And you're seeing it, you may not need it all the time, but when you need it, you'll need it. And you're starting to see some, I don't call it technical proficiency. It's more strategy combined with a little bit less aggression and lunacy, and just a little bit tighter of technique and strategic consideration. And like I said, you may not need it all the time, but when you need it, you'll need it. And it's good to know that it's there.
And to add to something you said, we both have sports science backgrounds, so we could talk about this, how hard it was for Fiziev to do what he did, which he did so naturally, which is to chain together those longer combinations. Because even if you have proper stance and proper footwork and proper weight, when you string together 3-4 punches, and a lot of them are twisting motions like hooks, and you throw them all power shots, when you're twisting with that much torque, you will just lose balance, because that is the nature of torque. You will get thrown off balance by your own power, by your own velocity. So that was what was amazing about watching Fiziev, is he could twist and put those long combinations together, mixing in the hooks, all of them with full power, and not loses balance. The way a lot of even like trained high-level boxers throw their long combinations, they take a little bit off their punches, right? They don't throw them all 100% because they don't want to lose their balance. So when I was watching that, I was like, how is this dude not just falling over from his own swinging power? Because also he's swinging so fucking hard.
It's astounding. It really is. And sometimes whenever he's swinging, he's getting intercepted with hooks from Gagey too. And he just wears it like he's wearing a fucking helmet, doesn't budge, and comes back with like 3-2 right kick, or it should be 2-3 right kick, and he's just blasting combinations right back at him. And I'm thinking, like, if I were drilling this, I would fall. Right?
So balanced.
Like, it's pretty cool shit to see. And he's another one at 31 years old in a very, very deep division. I think we're going to see him making some noise for a while. I hope that he can mix it up a little bit and not be, I don't want to see him go the way of Michael Chandler in an attempt to be entertaining, get clipped and chipped, and not have a world title run in him. I think he's got the goods for that. I think he's got the vision. I think he's got the chin. I think he's got the aggression and the technique. My only worry is, like, if every fight is that kind of barn burner, it lets some people who might not have a chance have a chance. But then again, maybe I'm wrong, and he goes on a 4-fight win streak, knocking everybody out in the first, and I can just get fucked. That could very well happen too. I just like him a lot, and I want to see him keep winning.
Now, after round 1, it seemed clear Fiziev was the better fighter, but then Gaethje worked his way back into the fight. What happened?
I mean, we can distill this down to chin, straighter and tighter punches, and fatigue. When you throw punches, when you throw strikes like Fiziev does, it's going to wear on you. And not many people are built with the kind of chin that Justin Gaethje has. So you would think that the law of averages would tell you, if you keep hitting this asshole flush in the chin, eventually he's not going to be there. But Gaethje was still there. And then who knew Gaethje was going to go all Gaethje 3.0 and start stringing together jabs in the third round, and then just piece him up with like a real stiff jab and walk away with the third.
Speaking to that, Whitman fighters are all great jabbers, aren't they? There's definitely some team characteristics.
Yes. And they use it in a myriad of ways. Sometimes they'll use it as a way to keep active without a ton of physical output, right? And without a huge energy spent, or when they're seeing someone else start to fatigue a little bit. And they have the footwork to start finding that jab and the evasive footwork to go to that jab without giving up a bunch of lead leg kicks. So it's not like they just sitting boxing style, poking and plodding with that jab, poke, 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 and just getting fucking their their left knee destroyed by an orthodox fighter. They're giving some ground, they're shifting, they're showing some feints and shifts, and they're hitting that rear drop step, and then they're jabbing off it, then they're darting off to the right, and then they're coming back with 2-1-1, stepping off. If you try to crash distance, they come uppercut hook, and then they put the double jab right behind it and just sort of beat you on the exit. I like the way that they use that footwork to find those shots. And I think Whitman tends to make wrestler boxers better, right? He doesn't make them wild puncher wrestlers. He makes them wrestle boxers with some footwork. And what are you going to do against them? Are you going to try to crash that distance so they can just dump you on their back? Not that fucking Gagey would ever do that, because he just wants to punch you in the face anyway. But I just think he does an outstanding job of taking wrestlers and keeping things very fundamental, and not always in the same way. Like I said, it's a myriad of striking techniques to throw that jab as like a little flick jab, to throw it as a stiff jab, shotgun jab, reverse jab, jab off that back foot, double jabs, drop back, boom, come back up, jab, uppercut, hook, jab, 3-2, bang, stringing things together. Throwing that uppercut as like that little shovel uppercut, bang to the body, and then hooking off of it and coming back 1-1-2. And then for fighters like Gage, he finds that big two, almost like he's throwing a baseball, bang, whips it over the top. It's set up off the jab sometimes. But we're talking about Justin Gagey. Sometimes it's not fucking set up off anything. But I think Trevor Whitman does a really good job of incorporating that kind of footwork and that kind of jab-heavy consideration at times, especially when working with wrestlers.
And the other thing I like about Whitman fighters, which is a team characteristic, is whenever they get lost or the fight isn't going their way, they go back to the jab. And then from the jab, they try to work their way back into the fight. It's something all of them do. And it's just such a simple thing. And it's not even something Whitman has to call out. It's just drilled in them. And it pays huge dividends.
It does. And you hear me say distance, leverage, and timing. My old boxing coach used to always say that: distance, leverage, and timing, distance, leverage, and timing. And what the jab can help you reset is that distance and that timing. And it can put you in better position to get leverage off your big shots, right? Think about just sort of that posting and measuring. Bang, bang, bang. 1.5, big 2. Coming hard and heavy with it. Hooking off that jab and coming bang, big heavy with that too. And setting those things up by just sort of leading them into mirroring your hand position and then punching where they're not, where their hands aren't. So finding those shots. Again, if it's distance, leverage, and timing, you know that the jab has a huge distance component and timing component. It is a great range finder and is great at resetting your rhythm. And you don't see a lot of really good jabbers coming out of their stance a lot. They're not always wild and all over the place. They tend to maintain stance and have the ability to reset and consider stance. And if you want good leverage on your shots, you'll want a good stance. So all three of those components are at least somewhat touched by having an educated jab and using the jab correctly.
If you love the Southpaw Project, become one of our financial supporters. It'll help us supplement the cost of running this project, the incredible time and energy we put into it 7 days a week, and you'll be giving us some breathing room, not only to juggle Southpaw with our day jobs, but also to expand Southpaw into other areas. We can't exist without your contributions. Show your Southpaw solidarity by supporting us at southpawpod.com. Now let's go back to the judging conversation, because I want to bring up something to educate our listeners, and it's something Dan Tom is really good about, which is talking about the scoring criteria and biases. At the end of the fight, Vazeev seemed shocked and dejected that he lost, And I want to explain why that is. Fiziev lives in Thailand. He's the striking coach for Tiger Muay Thai. He coaches Muay Thai and has fought a lot of Muay Thai and is heavily involved with Muay Thai. In Muay Thai, leg kicks, body shots are scored much higher than they are in MMA. I think one championship is different because it scores striking more from a Muay Thai perspective. Since the whole fight was contested on the feet and since Fiziev landed more shots to the legs and body and mixed it up more, and even when he did throw punches to the head, he rocked Gaethje several times, meaning he was closer to finishing the fight with punches than Gaethje was, even though Gaethje landed more headshots. This is why Fiziev believed he won. If this was scored by Muay Thai or one judges, he probably would have won. So headhunting just makes sense for MMA because of the bonuses, because you're wearing small gloves, so it's easier to knock someone out or cut them, and because of the judging. Jason, do you think fans really appreciate body shots, or is that something you can't really appreciate unless you feel it?
In the year 2023, you shouldn't have to be told that leg kicks hurt and that body shots will absolutely annihilate the person's inner organs, right? The vital organs, the liver, the kidney, like all that shit gets all mangled. If you don't know that by now, then you haven't watched enough combat sports to be worthy of entertaining, right? But unfortunately, like body kicks don't show a lot of blood, right? Unless you follow them to the bathroom and see them pissing blood because their kidneys are fucking wrecked, and short of putting these fighters in a full body PET scan or MRI and saying, hey, how much damage was really done before we go to the judges, the easiest thing to visually quantify is facial damage, and some fighters wear it better than others. Some people just have thicker skin or more grizzled features that don't welt as easily. Others welt easier and cut easier. So what do you consider damage? I mean, I would think that some damage to the liver that a fighter fought through would probably be worse than the bloody nose, but fans love the motherfucking bloody nose. So I don't know what to tell them unless we can line them up and just start beating the living shit out of their livers and kidneys and saying, how you feel now, man? I mean, it's those same fans are the ones going, just get up. As if that right, as if it's that easy with another human being on you, or whenever you get dropped because of the vasovagal response or the nerve in the liver that says, hey, stay the fuck down. I don't know. The one thing I think helps for the more technical fighter who's doing some body work and leg kicks is like what Leon Edwards did very well in his leg kicks. They were so obvious and at distance, and they seemed to affect the footing. And at times even though like Usman is another very grounded fighter that doesn't fall all over the place, but there were times where the kicking made it very apparent who the better technical fighter was in that fight. As good of a technician as Usman really is. And he's, for a fighter whose wrestling is his dominant skill set and his first skill set, his boxing and kicking is fucking fantastic. It's a testament to him and his training, his coaching, everything. He's in his commitment to the sport. But Leon Edwards was obviously the better striker, and it looked it when you watched them fight. Like, even in that second round, that I thought maybe Edwards might have lost, I was still more confident. If I were a cornerman, I would have been more confident, no matter how you score that fight, knowing that Leon Edwards found his timing, knew how to disrupt the rhythm of Usman, who can be both a good pressure fighter and, or he can wrestle or fight off the counter if he wants to a little bit. He could be patient. It just seemed like he was able to technically disrupt him.
That's a great comparison between Leon Edwards and Rafael Fiziev, because Leon, because he was further out and in distance, everything he threw had an exclamation point on it. Whereas Fiziev, it's almost like his speed and the fact that he was throwing in such long combinations hurt him in the judging perspective, because it was hard to see what was actually landing and not landing. And because he threw something right after the last one, you didn't see that impact, because Justin is now having to react to the next thing and to the next thing, right? So it didn't have exclamation points. So I think that type of fighting makes it harder to judge. And especially because UFC is in a cage, not like a Muay Thai ring. And the preferential positioning around the cage is for the camera people and for the videographers, right? So there's often a complaint that judges are in the worst areas around the cage, so they can't see very well, because also there's a fence. So when you as a judge, your view is already obstructed and you're moving that fast and it's hard to tell what you're doing because you're throwing these long combinations. Yeah, I can see how judges can't really appreciate what you're doing, even if they are educated in it because of all those other variables. Like maybe if they saw the same fight in a ring, they would have seen more of the action, just the fact that there's nothing obstructing their view.
Absolutely. And to your point, if you had a better angle, or if Fiziev was fighting anyone, not Justin Gaethje, but Gaethje does have a tendency to get punched or kicked out of position, but he's also so aggressive and he counters, I don't even say well, I'll just say effectively, and so goddamn hard that even when he misses and he sort of like hits you with his forearm in the shoulder, you just hear a loud smack, a ton of sweat. It's someone's blood is always flying when he's fighting. So it's harder to quantify, right? It's harder to visually count who's doing what, because it's so exciting and chaotic in there. And I think that's one thing that Gaethje does well. And the fighters who have been, been able to weather some of those storms, or when he has sort of punched himself out, like Eddie Alvarez fight would be one I would point to, and the Poirier fight. I don't know who was winning until Gaethje lost. I couldn't tell you who was winning either of those fights, because again, they're wild, they're violent, they're chaotic, and there's so much happening that it's a little bit tough. But I'll say it again, and I'm biased because I tend to have my bias for wrestlers, but I'm more recently strikers who really understand this game. I really start to now they have a place in my heart. I almost want them to beat the wrestlers, because I don't like because I can wrestle, I can just get wild and say fuck it, and then everyone turns into Michael Chandler and starts talking about how exciting they are, and I could really give a shit. I want you to win if you're my guy. The excitement will come if you stay great at fighting. If not, you're a fucking novelty at that point, right?
Fiziev actually needs to make the same adjustment Gaethje made, because you brought up two old fights, and in those fights, that old classic Gaethje, he would punch himself out until he was gassed. And that's kind of like what Fiziev does too, where he's punching so much and so hard, he's gassing in the later rounds. And now you're seeing Gaethje in this fight, and even in his previous fights, he doesn't gas like he used to, because he's much more measured. Even in this chaos, he was still more measured than how he used to be when he first arrived in the UFC. And I think that's the same thing Fiziev needs to do, because Gaethje needed to make that change to make that championship run, and Fiziev needs to do the same.
I agree 100%. 100%. And I think when he does that, he'll have to start doing that in 5-round fights, right? And once he does that and he realizes that he has it, what do I say? You don't need it till you need it. And if you want to be at the highest levels of the sport, you're going to need it. So some greater consideration is a must. And I hope he starts doing that. I think he's one of those fighters that hates losing probably more than he likes winning. And he will start to assess, or maybe he's just all thrill and kill and just wants to keep punching people until he gasses out and doesn't give a shit. I could be wrong. I don't know the fucking guy, but I'm hoping that that as a fighter, he can digest this kind of loss and understand that those knockouts against some of these 155 pounders will come if he stays in it, right? And that may not be at the end of 15 minutes, but maybe if he's fighting in 5-round fights, if he's in these 5-round fights, you're going to start seeing it at the 17th minute, the 18th minute, the 21st minute. And you just have to find it at that time and being a little more strategic, or rather than headhunting so much, you start fucking chipping away at those legs a little more, because they've had to chase you a little bit. And I'm not saying to be some sort of neo footwork counter fighter, but not always being in the pocket that deeply. You might be able to find a little more once in a while because you can make some greater reads. And he just looked a little bit labored in that third round and even towards the end of the second. And when you put 100% on everything you throw, I think that's bound to happen.
But I want to point out something I previously mentioned about Gaethje. And in this fight, I noticed it applies to Whitman fighters in general, because we had two Whitman fighters. We had Justin Gaethje and Kamaru Usman, which is how they sometimes punch with their middle knuckles. So I don't mean the knuckles you normally punch with, but the ones underneath them in the middle of your fingers, where your fingers actually bend and fold. I noticed both Gaethje and Usman use them to punch and scrape, which is an old bare knuckle and karate technique to cut your opponent, or even a legal way to poke the eye. It worked really well against Fiziev, but against Edwards, Leon's quick straight shots and kicks were beating Usman's loopy grazing punches. Rather than covering up like last time, Edwards did a lot with the long guard to deflect those punches, but also rolling, slipping, pulling back, and crashing into the punches. It's those middle knuckles is why Usman is able to land on opponents who think they're out of range. In the first round, Edwards would slightly pull back and the jab would miss. And then later on, Usman would throw with those middle knuckles, getting him a little bit extra range, and it would catch Edwards by surprise. You could even tell that he was shocked that the punch hit him this time because he thought he knew that range. Gaethje has short arms, so he needs those middle knuckles. So this isn't anything about the fight. This is more of a technical aside for listeners to know there's a lot of ways to punch. It's not just about turning the fist over or even vertical punching. You could even like punch with different parts of your hands. And then you could even like use it in different ways to not just hit or poke, but sometimes even cut and graze. Some people even like to throw an uppercut in a grazing manner to try to cut you instead of just hit you on the jaw. So these are some old time tricks.
Absolutely. You brought up the bare knuckle, the bare knuckle techniques. One thing that Gaethje does exceptionally well is off clinches. He will throw that overhand. Even if he snatches a single leg and you bring it back, he'll release it and whip that right hand over the top. And so being able to, like, those are all forms of setups for that style of punch that may not look as beautified technically because you don't see it that way, but goddamn if it's not effective. You know, if you get those knuckles just ripping down your face, or all these fighters start looking at the ref because they got punched in the goddamn eyeball, and they literally got punched in the eyeball, and you realize it's some fighters find those shots over and over and over, and it is a viable technique, and it's a really good MMA technique that you can find. Call it dirty boxing. I guess if you're boxing with 4-ounce gloves, that's dirty in general because they're supposed to be 10s and 10s or more. So, you know, that situation calls for some greater consideration. And those who can find those shots, if they can, they will.
Yeah, when you mentioned how Gaethje will throw that right like a baseball, right? Then the way the hand comes down, then you will hit with the middle knuckles. And it's like, he doesn't care how it lands. Either it's just going to thud and look good to the judges, or it's going to hit you on the top of the head and knock you out. Or if it misses you, it could still just graze your face. And I noticed Kamaru Usman doing something similar where instead of just punching straight out, or even in an overhand way, he would throw the two and then just bring it straight down, like trying to scrape Leon's face with his knuckles. And so these are like all little sneaky things I think Whitman is teaching his fighters to be like, this is other ways to win the fight. You know, you cut them.
I agree. And here's what I'll say also about Trevor Whitman. There are coaches that love to be heard, that love to hear themselves and love to have moments to be captured on camera and on mic. He says some of the most mundane shit just to get his fighters to calm down and listen. And it is actually the most brilliant thing I've ever heard. He's not doing it in any way to be a corner celebrity, to overshadow his fighters, to be quirky.
Team elevation,
right? You know what I mean? You know exactly who the fuck I'm talking about. Those coaches that tend to look at themselves on the big screen while their fighters' names getting announced. And I'm like, why do you only have one sleeve on, Dewey Cooper? Like, what are you doing, buddy? Anyway, I digress. He does it to be effective in communication with his fighter. That's what he does. And then the rest of his team starts to follow suit. And you see that those adjustments, even when they're losing, they don't look panicked. And when you can get some of these fighters who are just either wound so tightly or if fucking like a screw is loose or whatever, like has them go like attracted to fighting and gravitate towards such a violent, chaotic thing. He is able to get them dialed in the moment. And I love that about him. It isn't pseudoscience or this like overt, preachy sports psychology. And it sure as hell isn't a Rocky speech. It is clear communication that taps in to the repetition and exposure of the correct technique so that he can bring it out at the right time. And I fucking love it. And I hate, you know me, I hate everybody, and I hate jumping on bandwagons. But listening to some of the corner work, I was just really impressed.
Jason, any other final takeaways you want to give about this event?
To the folks out there, the fans who love to hate, trust me, from a fellow hater, like you got to start giving some of this shit some respect. Because if you're complaining about Leon Edwards versus Usman,
oh my God, in one of the best fights
against Usman 3, I'd never want to be your waiter. I'd never want to be your server. Like, seriously, how much complaining do you fucking do for a living? I couldn't stand it.
I mean, if it wasn't for Justin Gaethje versus Rafael Fiziev, that was the fight of the night.
Yeah. And I keep hearing people hate on it over. And I'm like, geez, what fight were you watching? And I didn't watch it live. I watched it early the next morning. And I kept reading some of the Twitter, the twittering.
Why are you reading it?
I don't know. I was trying to find someone told me Donald Trump might be arrested. I was like, no, let me check it out. All I keep hearing is how bad this fight was. And I'm trying to see.
Oh my goodness.
I'm telling you, MMA Twitter is just like a really fucked up world. It is so bad.
And bad.
So that's the takeaway to those assholes.
I mean, to your point, I saw somebody on MMA Twitter calling Sean Strickland a feminist, and he's been brainwashed by feminism. So if you think Sean Strickland is a feminist, then what does that say about MMA fandom if they're more to the right of Sean fucking Strickland?
If MMA Twitter is to the right of Sean Strickland, then the ratchet effect is very real. We're all fucking doomed.
All right, that's it for this fight study. Thank you all for listening.
All right, thank you guys.
If you like this episode and like what we do, support us on Patreon. We also have the Liberation Martial Arts program if you want to train with us from wherever you are. You'll find lots of techniques, exercises, theory, pedagogy, and even political theory. We also have Fighters Brew, which is a manga-inspired martial arts audio series, as well as Fighters Brew transcripts that include martial arts tutorials. You can find Liberation Martial Arts online along with Fighters Brew on Patreon. You can find Southpaw merch at our store. You can find all pertinent links on the show notes. With all that said, thanks for listening.